A compass spins without direction. A whistle sings when no one blows it, and a lone trail of footprints crosses where no human should have walked. Those who've heard the story know it's not about getting lost, it's about being chosen. Stay close, hit like, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, as we follow the path that blurred the line between man and mercy. When the avalanche swallowed Cedar Hollow Village, it didn't just take homes. It erased laughter names and the sound of belonging. The white came all at once, roaring down the mountain like a living thing devouring cabins' fields and every dream that had ever stood still long enough to freeze. 12-year-old Malik Carter, a black boy born under the breath of pine and frost, was outside stacking firewood when the mountain broke loose. His father shouted from the porch, his mother ran from the greenhouse, still holding a tin bowl of seeds, and Shadow, his black shepherd, barked, once a sound swallowed instantly by the storm. Malik looked up in time to see the ridge collapsing, a wall of snow glittering under sunlight, as if heaven itself had turned to ice. Then came the sound, the grinding scream of earth itself tearing open. His father's voice reached him, faint but sharp. Run. But before he could move, the world went white. Malik was thrown backward into the drift, swallowed by cold and noise. When silence returned, it wasn't peace, it was absence. Hours later, he woke beneath a crust of ice lungs burning. The air was still. He clawed upward, broke through, and gasped at the pale sky. Around him lay no village, only a smooth, endless sheet of snow. No roofs, no chimneys, just white. His father's watch ticked weakly near his boot, half buried, and beside it, Shadow whimpering alive but pinned beneath a shattered beam. Malik dug with bare hands until his nails bled, freeing the dog's leg. The shepherd licked his wrist, once a quiet promise, then leaned into him for warmth. Malik pressed his forehead to the dog's neck. "We're all that's left," he whispered, his voice shaking more from grief than cold. The sky began to dim, and Malik stumbled toward where his home had been. He found only fragments, his mother's scarf red against the snow, like a wound, and the wooden carving his father made for him last Christmas, now cracked in half. He sank to his knees, clutching both to his chest. Shadow sat beside him, silent, as if mourning too. Malik whispered, "I'll come back," but even he didn't believe it. That night, a storm gathered again, crueler than the first. Malik found the old storm shelter under a ridge, its door warped but still standing. Inside, 12 survivors huddled together, eyes hollow. The room smelled of sweat, fear, and frozen earth. Mrs. Turner from the greenhouse rocked a baby that no longer moved. A man handed Malik a piece of bread hard as stone. "We wait," the man murmured. "Help will come." But the way he said it sounded like a prayer to something that had already died. Malik sat in the corner with Shadow curled beside him, clutching the compass his father had slipped into his jacket pocket the day before. He had never noticed the engraving until now, scratched faintly on the back, "For my son follow the heart, not the needle." His chest tightened. His father had known. Maybe he'd seen the signs on the ridge before anyone else did. Maybe he'd known the mountain was ready to fall. And maybe giving Malik the compass wasn't hope, it was goodbye. The next morning, the survivors tried to dig. They uncovered bodies. None were his parents. Malik watched as men whispered over a broken sled, as if afraid to speak too loud and wake the mountain again. A young woman cried until she couldn't breathe, then stopped as suddenly as she started. Everyone looked older by the hour. Someone suggested heading down to the valley, but no one had the strength. The mountain had taken it. Malik couldn't stay. Every breath inside that shelter tasted like the dead. He waited until the others slept, their faces lit by the weak glow of a lantern, then packed what little he had. 2 strips of jerky, the compass, the scarf, and a flint. He hesitated at the door. Shadow stared at him, head tilted, as if asking if this was truly the way. Malik nodded. "If we stay, we die." The dog pressed close, and together they stepped into the storm. The wind cut like glass, but the snow underfoot gleamed faintly with moonlight guiding them upward. Each step hurt, but Malik kept moving. He thought of his mother's voice reading psalms on quiet nights, his father teaching him how to track deer, saying patience is louder than fear. Now, patience was all he had left. At the ridge, he turned to look back. The shelter's faint lantern glowed like a dying heartbeat. He wanted to believe someone down there was praying for him, but deep down he knew it didn't matter. The mountain didn't grant prayers, it tested them. By dawn, Malik found a clearing where the snow had thinned. He built a fire from fallen branches, hands shaking as he struck flint to steel. The spark caught a small defiance against the cold. Shadow lay beside him, breath slow and steady. For a moment, Malik allowed himself to cry. Not the quiet tears of exhaustion, but the kind that came from knowing there was no one left to answer when you called home. "I'll make it," he told the dog, his voice breaking. "For them, for us." The compass needle glowed faintly in the firelight, pointing north. Malik turned it over once more, tracing the hidden words on the back with his thumb. Follow the heart, not the needle. Hunger began its quiet war inside him. The jerky was gone, the water frozen in the canteen. Malik tried to melt snow in his hands, but it only numbed him deeper. Shadow limped, leaving a trail of blood where his paw had cracked. When Malik saw it, he tore a strip from his sleeve and tied it gently around the wound, whispering, "We'll rest soon, I promise." The promise felt heavy, like something too big for him to keep. That afternoon, they found the skeleton of an old fence line half buried in frost. Malik followed it downhill, hoping it led somewhere human, but all it led to was silence. He stopped once to listen, thinking he heard voices under the wind. They weren't voices, just the mountain groaning beneath the ice. When the sky turned gray, Malik gathered broken twigs and built a small fire. It smoked more than burned, but Shadow lay beside it, soaking in whatever heat it offered. The boy watched the smoke twist into the air and imagined it carrying his parents' laughter up to heaven. "If you can hear me," he said softly, "we're still trying." The snow fell heavier that night. Malik wrapped his blanket around Shadow first, then crawled beside him for warmth. He dreamed of their old cabin, the smell of cinnamon tea his mother humming, while his father whittled by the fire. But when he woke, the only sound was the wind dragging itself across the valley. He pressed the compass into his palm until it hurt. The engraving on the back, "Follow the heart, not the needle," felt like it was mocking him now. He whispered, "Then where is my heart supposed to go?" And Shadow raised his head as if to answer. The next day they moved east, or at least what Malik thought was east. The clouds hid the sun, and every tree looked like the last. After hours of walking, his stomach cramped so hard he fell to his knees. Shadow nosed the ground nearby, then began digging. Malik crawled beside him, confused, until he saw it a frozen rabbit snare, old, but still holding what was left of its catch. He didn't question the miracle. He lit a small fire with shaking hands and cooked what little meat remained, splitting it in half. Shadow wouldn't eat until Malik took the first bite. "You're stubborn," Malik said with a weak laugh, and the dog wagged his tail once. That night they sheltered beneath a fallen pine. The stars finally appeared, cold and sharp above them. Malik lay awake, counting his breaths, whispering to the dark, "I'm still here." In the distance, something answered, not a voice, but a low, rumbling sound that crawled across the snow. Shadow's ears perked, his growl low and uncertain. Malik's pulse quickened. The sound faded as quickly as it came, leaving only silence again, but now that silence felt watched. He couldn't sleep after that. At dawn, they climbed higher, following the faint line of a frozen creek. The world above the tree line was endless white, the kind of emptiness that could drive a person mad if they stared too long. Malik's legs trembled with each step. Once his father had told him about men who got lost in the mountains, how they started seeing ghosts of the people they missed most. That afternoon, Malik saw his mother's shadow between the trees, her scarf fluttering in the wind. He ran toward it, heart pounding, but when he reached the spot, there was nothing. Only a swirl of snow where the figure had been. Shadow barked sharply, snapping him back to reality. Malik fell to his knees, shaking, and pressed his hands into the cold earth. "Don't do that to me," he whispered, as if the mountain could hear. Shadow whined and nudged the compass against his arm, grounding him in the present. By the third day, the storm cleared enough to see the horizon. That's when Malik noticed something in the distance, a dark line breaking the monotony of white. At first he thought it was another ridge, but as they got closer, it became clear a row of pine trees, thick and alive, sheltering something behind them. Hope flickered inside him, small but fierce. He quickened his pace despite the pain in his legs. When they reached the trees, he found a narrow clearing, and at the far end stood a wooden structure, half buried in snow, a cabin. Smoke-stained walls, shattered shutters, a collapsed roof on one side. Shadow sniffed the air, uneasy. Malik's hands trembled as he approached. The door hung open, creaking slightly with each gust of wind. Inside, it was dark, the air thick with dust, and something else, something musky and sharp like animal scent. Malik's breath caught when he saw the furniture overturned, claw marks gouged deep into the walls. "It's shelter," he whispered. "Just shelter." Shadow's growl said otherwise. Still, they stepped inside. Malik lit a small fire from old chair legs, warming his hands. On the mantel, he found a rusted lantern and a photograph blackened by time, a man in ranger's uniform with a woman and 2 children. The name carved faintly into the frame read J.T. Winter, 1973. Malik said it back carefully. "Guess we're not the first ones lost here," he murmured. Shadow circled once, then lay down his head on Malik's boot. For the first time in 3 days, they were out of the wind. Malik let his eyes close, exhaustion wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. But before sleep claimed him, he thought he heard it again. The same low rumble from the night before, closer this time, resonating through the wooden floorboards. He opened his eyes to see the fire flicker violently, smoke curling toward the cracks in the wall, as if drawn by something breathing on the other side. Shadow lifted his head, a growl rising in his chest. Malik held the compass tight. "It's okay," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. The rumble stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than before, almost alive. The grooves were wider than his palm, and the wood around them was darkened with old sap. He swallowed hard and told himself it had been years since anyone or anything lived here. Still, the silence pressed against his ears like something heavy. He thought about the rumble he'd heard the night before and tried to convince himself it was just shifting snow or the mountain settling. But when he moved to feed another stick into the fire, Shadow's head shot up. The dog's ears perked, his muscles tensed, and a low growl rolled from his chest. Malik froze, staring toward the open door. For a moment, all he heard was wind whistling softly through the cracks, but then came another sound, a faint crunching, slow and deliberate, like heavy footsteps moving through snow. Malik's pulse quickened. He reached for the dull knife he kept tucked in his coat. His father's old blade that had once cut rope and skinned rabbits. Now it was all he had between himself and whatever was out there. The sound moved closer, then stopped. The wind fell still. Malik could hear his own breathing, shallow and loud in the silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. Shadow relaxed slightly, but didn't look away from the door. Malik whispered, "It's okay, boy," though he didn't believe it. He checked the compass again, even though it couldn't tell him what he really wanted to know: how to get home, how to bring back what he'd lost. The needle trembled, pointing north, as steady as always. He turned it over and read the engraving again. Follow the heart, not the needle. He didn't understand how to do that when his heart only ached. When dawn came, the fire was nothing but cold ash. Malik stepped outside, squinting against the brightness. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, the forest behind him like a wall of teeth. He turned to look at the cabin. From the outside, it seemed smaller, more fragile, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The air was still heavy with that strange, musky smell, a mix of damp fur and earth. Shadow sniffed the ground, whining softly. Malik followed his gaze and saw enormous paw prints press deep into the snow circling the cabin. Each print was wide and heavy, the claws long enough to catch the light. His stomach twisted. "Bear," he whispered. The word barely made it past his lips. He thought of the claw marks on the walls of the rumbling outside the night before, and a cold wave of realization hit him. The cabin wasn't abandoned. It had been reclaimed. Whatever had lived here had only stepped away for the season, and now it was back. Panic crawled up his spine, but he forced himself to breathe. He had to think. The bear had left, at least for now, maybe searching for food. That meant he had time. He stepped back inside and began searching the cabin more carefully. Near the fireplace, half hidden under broken boards, he found an old tin box filled with rusted nails, a small hatchet, and a folded paper so brittle it nearly fell apart in his hands. He unfolded it slowly, eyes widening as he recognized a rough map of the area. The hand-drawn lines showed the river, the ridge, and a path labeled East Shelter. Beside it, initials carved in shaky handwriting, J.T. Malik felt his heart hammering faster. Whoever J.T. was, they'd known this mountain, maybe even survived it once. Maybe the same man from the photograph on the mantle. He glanced toward it again, the man in the ranger's uniform smiling beside a woman and 2 children. It was strange to see a happy family frozen in a place that smelled like death. Malik whispered, "Did you make it out?" The picture didn't answer, but in the quiet, the mountain seemed to breathe. By afternoon, clouds rolled in again, gray and heavy. Malik decided to wait out the storm before following the map. He gathered whatever wood he could find, barricaded the door with a broken table, and sat near the fire with Shadow. The dog's head rested on his lap, the rhythmic thump of his tail, a comfort Malik didn't know he needed. He thought of his parents, the way his mother hummed softly, while cooking the way his father's laugh filled the cabin back home. He wondered if they'd be proud of him for surviving this long, or angry that he'd left the shelter. Maybe both. He took the compass from around his neck and held it to the firelight. "You told me to follow my heart," he murmured to the engraved words, "but all I've got left is fear." Shadow licked his hand once, and Malik smiled weakly. "Guess that's better than nothing." The storm hit by nightfall. The wind howled, shaking the walls, but the fire stayed strong. Malik dozed off against Shadow's side, the dog's warmth anchoring him in the cold. He dreamed of his father standing at the tree line, calling his name, smiling the way he did when they went hunting together. "You're almost there," his father said, in the dream voice echoing softly. "Don't stop now." Malik tried to reach for him, but the snow swallowed everything again. He woke with a start, the fire down to embers. Shadow was already alert, ears forward, a growl low in his throat. Malik's pulse raced. Then he heard a snort, heavy breathing just beyond the wall, the sound of claws scraping wood. The bear had returned. Malik froze, barely daring to breathe. The scratching grew louder, circling the cabin. He grabbed the hatchet heart, slamming against his ribs. The door shuddered once, then again, the hinges groaning. Malik whispered, "Stay quiet," and Shadow obeyed, muscles quivering, eyes burning in the dim light. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The bear moved away, its footsteps fading into the night. Malik didn't sleep again. He sat with his back against the door, gripping the hatchet until his hand went numb. When dawn came, he found new claw marks on the outside, fresh ones sharp and deep. The bear wasn't done with them. He knew it would come back. Shadow lay pressed against his side, eyes open, ears twitching toward the faintest noise. When the first crack of ice echoed outside, Malik froze. It wasn't the mountain shifting this time. It was weight steady and rhythmic, pressing down on the crusted snow. Footsteps. He moved slowly toward the window, breath-shallow fingers tightening on the handle of the hatchet. Outside through the frosted glass, the forest stood still. The trees were black veins against a white sky, the wind lazy but cold. Then a shadow moved between the pines, huge, deliberate, moving toward the cabin. Malik's chest tightened. Shadow growled low, a sound more warning than threat. Malik whispered, "Stay," and the dog went silent, but alert, every muscle coiled. The shadow stopped near the tree line. A faint snort rose over the wind, followed by the crunch of snow, as the bear began circling the cabin again, just like before. Malik stepped back, his heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. He remembered the words carved on the map, East Shelter. If he wanted to survive, he'd have to leave soon, but not now. Not while the bear was near. He watched as its dark form moved slowly around the clearing, heavy shoulders rolling head low. It was searching, testing the way predators do when they can smell something alive but can't yet see it. Malik held his breath. The bear's nose lifted toward the wind, and for a moment its eyes caught the reflection of light off the cabin window. Malik flinched back, heart in his throat. The bear paused, sniffed, and let out a low rumble that vibrated through the ground. Shadow whimpered softly, but didn't move. Malik whispered, "It's okay, boy. It's okay, though." His voice trembled. Minutes passed, like hours, until finally the bear turned away, lumbering toward the woods. Malik waited until the sound of its footsteps faded before lowering the hatchet. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep hold of it. He sank to his knees, exhaustion and adrenaline crashing into him all at once. Shadow rested his head on Malik's arm, the warmth of the dog's breath grounding him. "We can't stay here," Malik whispered. "It knows we're here." He pulled out the map again, studying the faded ink under what little light filtered through the frost-covered window. The trail to the East Shelter ran along a ridge near the river. It looked close, but in the mountains distance lied. He'd have to leave by midday to make any progress before dark. As he packed, he noticed something carved into the underside of the mantle that he hadn't seen before, a short phrase scratched deep into the wood. "Don't stay after dark." His pulse quickened. Whoever JT was, they'd known what lived here. He thought of the photograph again, the ranger and his family, and wondered if they'd ever made it to safety, or if they too had stayed too long. Malik tucked the photo into his jacket pocket. "You deserve to be remembered," he murmured. Shadow barked softly, as if agreeing. When the sun climbed higher, the snow outside glittered like crushed glass. Malik stepped out, the compass in one hand, the hatchet in the other. The cold bit deep, but the air felt clean free of the cabin's suffocating fear. He followed the trail of the bear's tracks, not because he wanted to, but because they led in the same direction he needed to go. He figured a creature that large would take the easiest route through the snow. For hours they moved in silence. The forest around them was hauntingly still, the trees heavy with frost, the sky an endless gray. Once Malik heard a branch snap behind them and spun around, but it was only the weight of snow falling from a pine. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. By afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying flakes that stung his cheeks. The temperature dropped fast, and the clouds rolled in thick and mean. Malik quickened his pace, knowing a storm was building again. Shadow trotted beside him, loyal and tireless, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure the past wasn't following. The ridge ahead steepened, forcing Malik to crawl at times. His fingers were numb, his breath ragged. The compass swayed under his coat, clinking softly against the button of his jacket, like a heartbeat he could no longer feel. When they finally reached the top, the sight below stopped him cold. The river stretched below, frozen solid, and beyond it, another cabin, smaller, newer smoke rising faintly from its chimney. Malik's chest surged with something like hope, something sharp and dangerous. "Someone's alive," he whispered, gripping Shadow's fur. But as he looked closer, He noticed something off. The smoke wasn't rising anymore. It hung low, twisting like fog. He hesitated, then started down the ridge. The snow was slick, and twice he slipped, catching himself before tumbling. By the time they reached the valley floor, the light had begun to fade. The cabin stood alone, no footprints in the snow, no sound except the wind. Malik's heart sank. He knocked once, then again. No answer. The door creaked open when he pushed. Inside, the air was stale, colder than outside. A lantern lay shattered on the floor, and the remains of a fire sat long dead in the hearth. On the table was a cup frozen solid, and beside it, a small journal. Malik opened it carefully. The writing was shaky. The ink faded. February 12th. Tracks again near the east wall. I thought they'd moved south. I was wrong. February 13th. Heard scratching. The cubs must be hungry. Can't risk another night. Malik's throat tightened. The last page was smeared the final words, barely legible. If anyone finds this, follow the river south at dawn. He dropped the book, looking around the room as realization settled in. The bear hadn't been hunting. It had been defending. The claw marks the noise, even the tracks they all led here to its territory. Shadow whined softly, picking up on Malik's unease. Malik whispered, "We're in her land." He backed toward the door, gripping the hatchet. Then from outside came a sound, a distant roar, not angry, but guttural and warning. Malik froze. Through the thin light, he saw movement near the tree line. The massive shape of the bear standing on its hind legs, staring straight at him. Shadow barked once, loud and defiant. Malik's instincts screamed to run, but something in the bear's eyes stopped him. He didn't need to guess whose they were. The bear had come back during the night, maybe, to check on its territory, maybe to see if the intruders had left. Malik crouched beside one of the paw prints, his hand trembling as he traced its edges. Snow dusted the ridges of the claws, still sharp and clean. "She's close," he murmured. Shadow sniffed the air, tail low, body tense but quiet. The air smelled of pine frost and something heavier beneath it, something like fur and wet earth. Malik straightened and looked towards the mountainside, where the snow gave way to rocky slope. Somewhere up there was her den. The journal's last entry echoed in his head. The cubs must be hungry. He felt a strange pull, not of fear, but of understanding. The bear wasn't hunting him. She was surviving the same way he was. Still understanding didn't make her less dangerous. He turned back inside, stoking what little fire remained in the hearth. The cabin creaked around him, wood swollen from years of snow and thaw. On the wall hung an old ranger's jacket, faded green and stiff with time. Malik brushed frost from the shoulder and saw initials stitched faintly into the fabric, JT. His chest tightened. "You made it this far," he whispered. "Maybe you made it all the way." He took the jacket down, shook it out, and wrapped it around himself. It hung big on his small frame, but it was warm, and when he slipped his hands into the pockets, he found something inside, a small wooden whistle tied with a strip of leather. He held it up to the light, noticing tiny carvings of pine trees etched along its edge. He blew softly, and the sound that came out wasn't sharp like a normal whistle. It was low and haunting, like the wind through distant branches. Shadow's ears perked, but he didn't bark. Malik pocketed it again, wondering what purpose it once served. He gathered supplies from the shelves, an old lantern, a handful of nails, a rusted can of beans so old he had to chip the ice off the lid and stuff them into his pack. He planned to move at noon, follow the river south, like the journal had said. He'd travel quietly, stay low, and avoid the ridge where the den likely sat. The plan made sense until he heard it, the faint, helpless cry of something small echoing from outside. It was soft, almost swallowed by the wind, but distinct. Shadow's head lifted immediately. Malik froze. The sound came again, higher this time, weaker. Against every instinct screaming to stay inside, Malik grabbed the hatchet and stepped out. The coals slapped him in the face. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying in the wind, but the cry came again from beyond the ridge of snow behind the cabin. He moved slowly, Shadow following close paws sinking deep into the drift. When he rounded the cabin, he saw it a small shape half buried in snow trembling. A bear cub. Its fur was matted with ice, one paw caught in an old steel trap half hidden under the frost. Malik's heart stopped. The cub tried to pull free, whining in pain. He looked around, scanning the tree line, knowing the mother couldn't be far. Every second he waited increased the risk. He dropped to his knees, whispering, "Easy, little one." The cub froze, eyes wide, panting. Malik reached into his pack for the hatchet and used it to pry the trap open, metal biting into his palms. When it snapped free, the cub pulled its leg close, limping backward, but not running. It looked at him once, making a sound halfway between a growl and a sob, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Malik exhaled shakily. "You did good," he told Shadow. "We did good." But even as he said it, he felt the ground tremble faintly beneath his boots. A sound rolled through the forest like thunder, deep, guttural, and angry. The mother was coming. Malik ran. He darted around the cabin, shouting inside. Shadow bolted ahead, leaping through the open door just as Malik slammed it shut behind them. The roar came again, closer, now shaking the windows. Malik pressed his back against the door, breathing hard. "She thinks we heard it," he whispered, voice cracking. The bear's weight hit the wall hard enough to rattle the nails loose. Shadow barked wildly, but Malik held up a hand. "No, boy, don't. Just wait." The bear growled, pacing outside. Its claws scraped against the wood, testing for weakness. Malik's eyes darted to the map on the table, tracing the route south again. If they could survive until dark, maybe she'd leave. Maybe she'd go back to her cub. But part of him knew better. The cabin was built over her hunting ground. He had freed her cub, but invaded her home. Nature didn't forgive trespassers. Hours passed in suffocating stillness. Malik sat with Shadow pressed against him, the dog trembling but quiet. The bear's pacing slowed, then stopped. Silence again, deep and waiting. Malik dared to peek out the window. The clearing was empty. The tracks led toward the ridge, vanishing into the mist. Relief flooded him so suddenly he almost laughed. He sank to the floor, leaning against the door. "She's gone," he murmured. "She's really gone." Shadow whined uncertain, but Malik smiled anyway. For the first time since the avalanche, he felt like he'd done something right, like the mountain might finally see him as more than a trespasser. He closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him. When he woke, it was night. The fire had died, and the cold crept in again. Shadow stirred, lifting his head. Malik reached for the lantern, lighting it with what remained of the oil. The light spread across the room, catching the frost along the floorboards, and something else. New claw marks, fresh and wet, streaked across the inside of the door. His breath caught in his throat. She hadn't left. She had waited. A heavy shadow passed across the window, followed by the sound of breath, slow, steady inches from the glass. Malik didn't move. Shadow growled softly, low enough to be more vibration than sound. Malik's hand found the wooden whistle in his pocket. He didn't know why, but he raised it to his lips and blew. The soft, mournful sound filled the cabin, trembling through the air. Outside, the bear froze. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the sound of footsteps retreating slow and steady, fading into the forest. Malik lowered the whistle, his hand shaking. It was his, he whispered. JT's. The bear had heard it before. The mountain seemed quieter now, less like an enemy, more like something watching, waiting to see what the boy would do next. Malik's fingers brushed against the wooden whistle tied around his wrist, the same one that had saved them from the bear. Sometimes he thought he could still hear the faint echo of its tone in the wind, a low hum that didn't belong to this world. He didn't know if it was imagination or the mountain whispering back. The The path south wasn't easy. The riverbanks rose steep and uneven, and the snow grew heavier the deeper they went. Each step took effort, but Malik didn't stop. The map from JT's cabin was tucked inside his coat, folded so many times it had begun to tear at the corners. The words East Shelter were barely legible now, but he clung to them like a promise. Somewhere out there, other survivors might exist. Maybe someone who knew the ranger. Maybe someone who could tell him why the whistle calmed the bear. The thought kept him moving even when his legs ached and his stomach groaned with hunger. Around midday, Shadow stopped suddenly, ears up, eyes fixed on the tree line. Malik froze. The forest stretched silent and endless ahead, but there, a glint of movement, too smooth to be animal. Malik crouched low and squinted. Between the trees stood a wooden post, half buried in snow, a rusted metal sign barely clinging to it. He brushed off the frost and read the faded words, U.S. Forest Service Ranger Outpost, 3A. Relief and dread hit him at the same time. It was proof that JT had been real, that this wasn't just a ghost story carved into old cabins, but it also meant this area had once been patrolled, and if it wasn't anymore, there was probably a reason. Malik followed the post's direction through the pines, his breath shallow from cold and anticipation. Soon a structure appeared through the white, small, low-roofed, and nearly swallowed by snowdrifts. The windows were broken, and the door hung off one hinge, but it was shelter. As he approached, a metal plate above the entrance caught the Light Station 3 established, 1970. He pushed the door open and a gust of stale, trapped air rushed out. Inside, dust coated everything. A desk with drawers half open, a cot with torn blankets, a stove rusted through the middle. But it wasn't empty. On the far wall hung a collection of ranger maps pinned under glass, and beside them, an old radio, larger than any Malik had seen the kind, powered by hand crank. Hope flickered through him like fire. He dropped his pack and crossed the room, brushing the snow off the radio's dials. "Please work," he muttered. He turned the crank slowly, feeling the resistance, then flipped the switch. A faint crackle filled the air, followed by silence. He turned the knob again. Another crackle, then a burst of static so loud it made Shadow bark. "Hello," Malik said into the mic. This is Malik Carter. Is anyone there?" He waited, nothing but the hum of empty air. He tried again, adjusting the dial a little left. "If anyone can hear me, I'm at Ranger Station 3. There's been an avalanche at Cedar Hollow. I need help. Please." The static deepened, rolled, then broke into a faint voice, distant and distorted. "Copy. Signal weak. Repeat." Malik's heart nearly stopped. Yes, I can hear you," he shouted, but before the voice could finish, the radio died. He turned the crank again and again, but the sound didn't return. The batteries were too weak. The silence afterward felt like punishment. He slammed his hand against the desk in frustration, the sound echoing through the hollow cabin. Shadow whimpered and nudged his arm. Malik sank down beside him, rubbing the dog's head. "I almost had them," he whispered. "I almost made them hear." He didn't cry, but the ache in his chest was worse than tears. He sat for a while staring at the radio, then noticed something else under the desk, half hidden by a fallen folder. A small wooden box marked with the same initials, JT. He pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside were old ranger tags, a compass nearly identical to his own, and a folded letter sealed in wax. The handwriting on the front was precise military style, and it read, "For whoever finds this trust, the mountain it provides." Malik unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The message inside was short. "If you hear the wind sing, you're not lost. The heart knows where the trail ends." He sat back reading it again and again until the words blurred. The whistle, the compass, the map. JT hadn't just left directions. He'd left faith, a kind of survival that wasn't about strength, but belief. Malik pocketed the letter and looked toward the ceiling where faint light filtered through cracks in the wood. Snowflakes drifted down like dust. "Thank you," he whispered. Shadow barked once, quiet and steady, as if agreeing. Malik gathered his things and decided to rest for a few hours before continuing. He fed the last of the beans to the fire and watched it flicker. The room glowed warm and soft, a rare peace settling in. He thought of his parents, of his father's steady hands guiding him through the woods, of his mother's voice when she read him stories about heroes who faced things bigger than themselves. He hadn't realized it then, but those stories had been preparing him for this. When he finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of the bear again, not chasing him this time, but standing at a distance, her cub beside her, both of them watching him walk away. He woke to silence. The fire had gone out, and the light filtering through the boards had turned blue. He quickly checked the map once more and stepped outside. The world had changed overnight. The snow glistened like glass, untouched. But as he looked back at the cabin, something caught his eye. Across the door, scratched deep into the wood, was the same symbol he'd found near the last cabin, 3 parallel lines. Only this time, beneath them was something new, a small circle perfectly drawn. Malik didn't know what it meant, but it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like direction. The mountain was still speaking, still guiding. He touched the mark once, then turned south. Shadow trotting beside him, tail brushing the boy's leg. As they moved into the trees, the wind picked up again, carrying a sound that made Malik stop in his tracks. It wasn't howling. It was a melody, low, soft, almost human. He took the whistle from his wrist and blew into it once. He could almost imagine the sound of the radio, again the faint human voice reaching through the static, calling him home. But the further he went, the more the silence returned, heavy and watching. The sun disappeared behind the ridgeline, and darkness came fast, dragging cold with it. Malik knew he needed shelter before the temperature dropped too far. He spotted a rise in the distance where the trees thinned, and what looked like the remains of another structure, half a roof, a collapsed porch, and a chimney still standing like a broken tooth against the sky. "Come on, boy," he whispered to Shadow. The dog stayed close, tail low, scanning the shadows. They reached the ruins just as snow began to fall again. The building had once been a ranger supply hut, smaller than the others. Its roof caved in, but the stone fireplace still intact. Malik gathered old planks and debris, stacking them for a fire. His hands were numb, his breath shallow, but soon enough, flames flickered to life, licking warmth into the room. The smell of smoke filled the air, reminding him of home, of the nights when his mother would make stew, while his father told stories about storms that could swallow men whole. Malik sat by the fire and pulled out the map. He traced the river's edge toward a marking labeled Echo Pass. That had to be where the shelter lay, maybe where the signal came from. He was close, closer than ever. Yet something about the air felt wrong. Shadow was restless, pacing near the doorway, ears pricked toward the darkness. Malik turned to listen. At first there was nothing. Then from far beyond the trees came a low, familiar sound, the deep rolling rumble of a growl carried by the wind. His stomach dropped. "It can't be," he whispered. But it was. The bear. The same sound that haunted his sleep. Shadow growled low in response, body stiff. Malik stood hatchet in hand, heart pounding. The mountain gave warnings before it took things, and he'd learned to listen. The growl came again, closer, now mixed with another sound, smaller, sharper, almost like a cry. Malik froze. It wasn't anger. It was pain. The memory of the trapped cub flashed in his mind, its helpless eyes staring at him through snow. Could it be another? Or was it her, again wounded? His instinct said to stay inside, keep the fire burning. But his heart remembered the message carved on his compass. Follow the heart, not the needle. He stepped outside. The cold bit instantly cruel and alive. Snow whirled around him, twisting under the pale moonlight. "Hello," he called, voice trembling. No answer, only the groan of wind. Shadow barked once, running a few paces ahead, then stopped, looking back as if urging him to follow. Malik hesitated, then moved toward the sound. They climbed the small ridge behind the hut, each step sinking deep. The noise came again, a rumbling moan muffled but close. Then through the veil of falling snow he saw her. The bear. The same mother who had spared him. She lay on her side, one paw twisted unnaturally blood-dark against the snow. Malik stopped, dead breath catching in his throat. The cub, smaller now, thinner, pressed its body against hers, nudging her face, crying softly. Shadow whined. Malik's instinct screamed to run, but the cub's sound pulled him closer. He took one careful step, then another. The bear lifted her head weakly, eyes locking on him. He froze. There was no rage this time, no growl, only exhaustion. She looked at him for a long moment, then let her head fall back into the snow. Malik swallowed hard. "I can't leave you," he whispered, though part of him knew she couldn't understand. Still, the words felt right. He moved closer, kneeling near her flank. The wound on her leg was deep. A branch, sharp and splintered, lodged in her muscle. She must have fallen during the storm. "Easy," he said softly, like he would to Shadow. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The cub growled weakly, but when Malik reached for the branch, the mother didn't move. With shaking hands, he gripped the wood and pulled. The bear's breath hitched a deep rumble, vibrating through her body, but she didn't strike. The branch came free with a wet sound, and Malik quickly packed snow against the wound to slow the bleeding. "You'll be okay," he whispered. "You have to be." He didn't know how long he sat there, only that, when he finally looked up, the stars had brightened above the valley, and the moon hung full and watchful. The cub had curled beside its mother, its eyes no longer afraid. Malik stood slowly. "I have to go," he said quietly. "I have to find the shelter." He turned to leave, but before he took 2 steps, a deep exhale brushed the air behind him. He looked back. The bear's eyes were open again, following him. Then slowly she lifted her uninjured paw and dragged it across the snow 3 times, forming the same mark he'd seen at the other cabins. Malik's throat tightened. "I understand," he said softly. "You're showing me the way." He nodded once, stepped backward, and turned toward the ridge. Shadow barked once, as if to mark the moment, and then they began moving again, following the trail of faint scratches that gleamed under the moonlight like symbols carved by fate. By the time they returned to the hut, the fire had nearly died. Malik added more wood, shaking from exhaustion. He sat cross-legged on the floor, Shadow resting against him, and stared into the flames. "She's not our enemy," he said aloud. "She's just trying to keep her family alive." The words felt strange, but true. He thought about his own parents, how his father had shielded him when the avalanche came, how his mother had run toward him instead of away. The mountain didn't take them out of cruelty. It had taken them out of chaos. Maybe nature wasn't against him at all. Maybe it had been trying to teach him something. Outside, the storm quieted. He felt the pull of sleep heavy and deep, but before he drifted off, he took the whistle from his wrist and held it to the firelight. The carvings along its edge seemed clearer now. Pine trees, mountains, and 3 lines etched into the base ending in a circle, the same mark the bear had left. He understood then that JT hadn't been leaving warnings. He had been leaving peace between man and mountain. Malik smiled faintly. "You knew," he whispered. "You already knew." He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire and the steady breathing of his dog surrounding him. In his dreams, the bear's growl wasn't a threat, but a song deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the world. When he woke at dawn, light spilled through the cracks in the roof. The air was sharp, clean, and still. Outside the door, a trail of prints led away from the hut, 2 large and 1 small, heading east toward the rising sun. Malik stepped outside and watched them fade into the horizon. The air had a strange weight there, the kind that made sound bend and linger. When Malik spoke, his words bounced back to him, warped and distant, like the mountain itself was repeating what it heard. It was beautiful and eerie all at once. He could feel the change in the air, the pressure, the silence between gusts of wind, and he knew they were higher than they'd ever been. His breath came out in ragged clouds. Shadow trotted ahead, pausing often to glance back, his ears twitching. Malik's boots slipped on ice, and once he nearly fell, catching himself on a branch that splintered under his glove. He looked down at the valley below, miles of snow and forest dotted with black scars where trees had snapped under the avalanche. Somewhere far behind lay Cedar Hollow, buried under 20 feet of silence. Somewhere in front he hoped lay salvation. "Almost there, boy," he said, his voice cracking. The compass swung against his chest, the needle steady and unwavering. The bear's mark, the 3 lines in a circle, was etched into his mind, a symbol that no longer frightened him. It was a direction of promise, and as he climbed higher, he started to believe that maybe he wasn't just following the mountain's path. Maybe he was walking inside something sacred, a story written long before he was born. By midday, they reached a narrow pass where the wind howled like a living thing. The cliffs on either side were steep, jagged, and streaked with frozen waterfalls that glimmered under the sunlight. Malik ducked his head against the gusts, pulling his hood tighter, and pressed on. The path narrowed until it was little more than a shelf of ice hugging the rock. One wrong step could send them both tumbling into the abyss below. He moved carefully, testing each foothold. Shadow followed, tail low, body tense but sure. Halfway across, Malik heard something new, an echo that wasn't the wind. A voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. He froze. "Hello," he called. The sound bounced back at him, distorted, but beneath the echo came something else, a second voice answering. It wasn't his. "Help. Please." It was thin, desperate, human. Malik's heart leapt. He turned toward the direction it came from, a slope descending into a shadowed crevice to the north. Did you hear that he whispered to Shadow, who barked once and started toward the sound? Malik followed, sliding down the incline, his hands scraping against the ice. The voice came again, clearer now. "Hear somebody." At the bottom of the slope, he saw a shape, a figure half buried in snow beside a shattered sled. Malik's breath caught. The person wore a parka, torn at the sleeve, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. He dropped to his knees beside them. The face was pale, the eyes half open but alive. "You're okay," Malik said quickly. "You're not alone." The person blinked, their lips trembling. I was with the search team," they rasped. "We were heading north. Then the storm." Malik's mind raced. A search team, someone had come looking. How long ago, he asked. The person coughed weakly. 2 days, maybe 3. The others, they went east when the radio failed. Malik pulled off his gloves and felt for a pulse, faint but steady. "You're safe now. I've got you." He unwrapped his scarf and wrapped it around the man's shoulders. Shadow sat close, keeping watch. The man looked at him with glassy eyes and whispered, "That's a good dog." Malik smiled faintly. "The best." He helped the man sit up slowly, then noticed something poking from his pocket. A badge with a familiar nameplate, J. Turner Forest Service. Malik froze. JT the Ranger. The ghost he'd been following wasn't dead after all. He was right there, broken, but alive. Malik's throat tightened. "You're JT," he whispered. The man frowned, confused, his gaze unfocused. "Do I know you?" Malik held up the wooden whistle. "You left this," he said. "You left the maps. The letters. You told me to trust the mountain." Recognition flickered in the man's eyes, faint but real. "The mountain," he murmured. "She gives and takes. Just like people." He winced in pain, coughing. Malik tore open his pack, searching for food, for anything that might help. He found a small tin of dried meat and handed it over, but JT waved it off. "Not for me," he said. "For you and the dog." Malik shook his head. "We can share." JT smiled faintly, his lips cracking. "You remind me of my boy." Malik felt his chest tighten. "He didn't make it, did he?" JT's eyes filled with something that looked like sorrow mixed with peace. "No," he whispered. "But I buried him up there near the ridge. The same mark I left for him. I left for you too. The mountain remembers who walks with mercy." Malik felt tears sting his eyes. He didn't know why this man's words hit so hard, only that they felt like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was saying. "You're gonna make it," Malik said. "There's a station west of here with a working radio. I talked to someone through it." JT shook his head slowly. "Battery's gone by now, but maybe you can fix it. You're stronger than you think." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "Take it. It has everything you need." Malik took it with trembling hands. The cover was marked with the same 3 lines and circle. "You made peace with her," JT said softly. "The bear, she guards this mountain. That's why she spared you." Malik nodded, unable to speak. "Go east," JT whispered. "Follow the river until it disappears. The shelter's there. You'll know it by the sound. The mountain hums when you're close." His breathing slowed, each word weaker than the last. "Tell them..." JT kept his promise. Malik gripped his hand. "I will," he said. "I promise." JT smiled once more, eyes fluttering shut. The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. Malik stayed there, his hand still holding the Ranger's until it went cold. Then he stood wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. Shadow whined, pressing against his leg. "We keep going," Malik said quietly. "We finish what he started." He looked down at the notebook in his hands, the whistle around his wrist, and the compass on his chest, all pieces of the same story. The notebook JT had given him lay open on his lap, the pages filled with sketches, coordinates, and short, precise entries that documented every patrol, every storm, every rescue attempt on the mountain for over 2 decades. The final page was written in unsteady handwriting that made Malik's throat tighten. "If I don't make it home, let the mountain keep my story. It's never been cruel, only truthful." Malik traced the words with his finger, then closed the book and looked toward the east. The wind carried no threat that morning, only a soft hum that moved like breath between the cliffs. It was faint at first, almost like memory, but as he stood and slung his pack over his shoulder, it grew louder, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. He remembered JT's final words, "You'll know it by the sound." The mountain hums when you're close. Shadow barked softly beside him, tail wagging once, sensing the shift in the air. Malik smiled weakly. "Let's find the song boy." They left the ridge behind, following the frozen river east, until it thinned into a narrow vein of ice. The further they went, the stranger the air became. The hum grew clearer, vibrating through Malik's boots, through his chest, until it felt like his heartbeat was syncing with it. The cliffs narrowed into a corridor of stone carved smooth by wind and time. Light filtered through cracks high above, refracting into shimmering bands that danced across the snow. Malik felt like he was walking through the ribs of something ancient. Every step forward seemed to pull him deeper into a memory that wasn't his own. At one point, the compass around his neck began to spin wildly, the needle trembling before snapping to a dead stop, pointing forward, as if it too had found what it had been searching for. Shadow stopped, suddenly. Ears perked. Malik followed his gaze and saw a shape ahead, half buried in the snow, large and curved. At first he thought it was another cabin, but as he brushed away the frost, his breath caught. It was a door, metal, and sealed tight, embedded into the side of the cliff. Above it, carved deep into the stone, was the same mark again, 3 lines and a circle. But this time, the circle was filled in smooth and black, as if scorched by fire. Malik pressed his hand to it. The metal beneath his glove thrummed with the same low hum vibrating in the air. This was it, the East Shelter, the place JT had written about. He turned the rusted handle, but it didn't move. He tried again, throwing his weight against it, but the ice held it shut. Shadow barked and began digging at the snow around the edges. Malik joined him, scraping at the frozen layers until his fingers bled. Finally, with a creak that echoed through the valley, the door gave way and swung open. Inside was darkness, the kind that felt heavy, ancient. Malik stepped forward, lighting his lantern. The glow revealed a narrow tunnel leading into the mountain. The walls were lined with steel and stone, and faint writing covered them. Names, dates, messages scrawled in charcoal and blood. "We made it this far. Keep going. The storm ends here." Malik's throat tightened. Every name felt like a whisper from the people who'd once sought safety here and never left. He followed the tunnel deeper, the hum growing louder until it became music, steady rhythmic, a song that wasn't made by human hands. The air warmed slightly enough to melt the frost on his eyelashes. Then suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber carved directly into the rock. Malik stopped dead. The shelter wasn't just a bunker, it was a sanctuary. In the center of the cavern stood a massive tree, its roots twisting through the stone floor, its branches glowing faintly as if lit from within. Ice dripped from the leaves, each drop ringing softly when it hit the ground, harmonizing with the mountain's hum. The air smelled of pine and ash and something clean, like the first breath after a storm. Malik walked forward slowly, eyes wide. "It's alive," he whispered. Shadow circled the tree tail, wagging gently, then sat beside its roots. Malik approached and touched the bark. It was warm. Beneath his hand, he felt a slow pulse, steady and strong. He remembered the phrase carved into JT's letter, "Trust the mountain it provides," and for the first time, he understood. This wasn't just survival, it was connection. The mountain wasn't a place to conquer. It was a living memory, holding everyone who'd ever walked its paths. Malik sank to his knees, tears freezing on his cheeks. "You were right," he whispered. "It's not cruel, it's home." He opened JT's notebook again, flipping through the pages until he found a blank one near the back. He took a piece of charcoal from the floor and began to write. "Malik Carter, Cedar Hollow. I followed the river and it brought me here. The mountain listens. It remembers. And it forgives." He set the notebook at the base of the tree and rested his hand on it for a long moment. Then he blew the wooden whistle. The sound filled the chamber, rising and blending with the hum until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Shadow howled softly, his voice joining the chorus. For the first time since the avalanche, Malik didn't feel small or broken. He felt part of something larger, infinite. When the sound faded, the tree's glow pulsed once brighter, and a faint breeze brushed through the chamber, warm and gentle, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. Malik closed his eyes, imagining his parents' faces, JT's smile, and the mother bear limping through the snow with her cub. All of them survivors, all part of the same breath. He whispered thank you, and the hum answered softer now, like a heartbeat fading into peace. When he and Shadow stepped back outside, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The wind had stilled. The peaks glowed gold under the rising sun. Malik turned back once, looking at the sealed door, now marked by a fresh pattern in the frost, 3 lines and a circle, drawn as if by invisible hands. The mountain had accepted his story. The descent began at dawn, when the sun stretched pale gold across the peaks, and the mountain breathed out mist that looked almost human in the light. Malik tightened the straps of his pack, the compass swinging gently against his chest, and looked once more toward the cliff where the shelter door lay hidden beneath the frost. He knew he'd never forget the sound that came from within the hum, that had felt like the earth itself exhaling after years of silence. It followed him even now, faint but steady like a heartbeat under the snow. "Come on, boy," he said softly. Shadow barked once and started down the ridge, his paws sinking deep into the powder. The trail wound narrow between the cliffs, sunlight catching the ice and scattering it into shards of color. The journey down was harder than Malik had expected. His legs ached from days of climbing, and the air grew thinner with each step. But there was no fear left in him, only calm. The mountain no longer loomed like a threat. It felt like a companion watching and whispering with every gust of wind. Halfway down, Malik stopped to catch his breath. From that height, he could see the valley stretched wide and endless rivers like silver veins cutting through the white. Somewhere beneath that snow lay Cedar Hollow, his home, his family, the life he'd lost. For the first time, the thought didn't hurt. The avalanche hadn't buried their love. It had buried his grief so he could dig something new out of it. "You'd like it here, Dad," he whispered. "You'd tell me the air smells like forgiveness." The wind stirred, then brushing his face with a warmth that shouldn't have been possible in that cold. He smiled. By afternoon, they reached the lower slopes where the pines grew dense again. Malik stopped by a fallen tree to rest and shared the last of the dried meat with Shadow, who ate slowly, eyes half closed from contentment. Malik leaned against the trunk, opening JT's notebook again. The last pages were filled now, the ranger's careful script fading into Malik's rough handwriting, 2 lives folded into one story. The words he'd written inside the mountain glowed faintly in the light. The mountain listens, it remembers, and it forgives. He traced them once with his finger, then closed the book. He kept his promise, he murmured. And now, I'll keep mine. When they resumed walking, the forest began to change. The snow grew thinner, and small patches of earth appeared beneath the trees. The air smelled different, damp, alive, filled with the faint scent of pine and thawing soil. Birds sang somewhere distant. Malik's heart quickened. Spring was coming early this year. The storm was finally over. He followed the river until it broke free from the ice, the water dark and restless whispering of movement and life. Shadow bounded ahead, splashing at the edge, tail wagging. Malik laughed, a sound he hadn't made since before the avalanche. It startled him at first, raw and strange, but it felt good, real. "You're right," he said to the dog. "It's time to go home." He walked along the bank until the sun began to sink behind the western ridge, painting the sky in fire. They came to a clearing he almost didn't recognize. The snow was thinner here, and in the middle of the open space stood a wooden post, crooked and half buried. Carved into it were faint words he could barely read. Cedar Hollow boundary. Malik stopped, his breath caught. "We made it," he whispered. The trees around the clearing looked familiar now. The old maple with the split trunk, the rise of stone where he used to stack firewood. Beneath the snow, he saw the outline of what had once been his family's cabin. Its roof collapsed, its chimney still standing. He walked slowly to it, his boots crunching on the ice, and stopped beside the broken doorframe. For a long time, he couldn't speak. The wind moved through the hollow, lifting snow into soft spirals, brushing against the scarf tied around his wrist. He knelt and placed the compass on the threshold, setting it where his father used to sit at night to tell stories. The needle quivered, then pointed toward the valley. Malik smiled faintly. "You can rest now," he said. He took off the ranger's jacket, folded it neatly, and set it beside the compass. "And you too, JT," he added. "Your trail didn't end. It just changed direction." Shadow sat beside him, head tilted, watching in silence. The sky deepened to amber, then to violet, and Malik stood again, feeling the stillness settle around him like a prayer. He looked towards the west, where the river shimmered under the dying light, and thought of the bear and her cub wandering somewhere beyond sight alive, because he had chosen compassion over fear. The mountain hadn't just tested him, it had trusted him. That realization filled him with something that felt like peace. He took the whistle from his wrist and held it to his lips one last time. The sound that came out was soft, slow, a lullaby carried by the wind. It rose and echoed through the valley, bouncing off the cliffs, fading into something almost holy. For a moment, the world seemed to listen. Then somewhere deep in the forest, a single answering call rose, a distant growl that wasn't anger, but acknowledgement. Malik lowered the whistle, smiling through tears. "Goodbye, friend," he said softly. "Thank you for showing me the way." As the final light of the day touched the snow, Shadow lay beside him, head resting on Malik's boot. The boy's gaze lingered on the horizon where sun and ice met in one endless gleam. He realized then that survival wasn't about winning against the mountain. It was about becoming part of its story, adding his heartbeat to the ones that had come before. His parents, JT, the bear. All of them bound by mercy, by the will to keep going. He whispered, "We weren't lost. We were learning where home really was." The air seemed to shiver in agreement. He stood there until the stars began to bloom overhead, their reflection glittering in the river below. When he finally turned to leave, he didn't take the compass or the jacket or even the scarf. He left them there, gifts to the mountain that had taken everything and then given it all back in a different form. He walked south, the moon guiding him Shadow's paw prints beside his own, forming two perfect lines in the snow. The hum followed them down the valley, quieter now, a heartbeat fading into distance, and as they disappeared into the trees, the wind picked up once more, not cold or cruel, but warm, carrying a single note that sounded like a whisper of thanks. The end. If this story moved you, if Malik's journey reminded you that mercy can grow even from loss, don't leave quietly. Hit like, subscribe, and share this moment with someone who still believes the human heart can find light even in the coldest places. Tell me in the comments what part of Malik's story stayed with you most. Was it the boy's courage, the bear's mercy, or the mountain's quiet forgiveness? And where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know how far this story has traveled.